Hello, tiny people. Here we go again. This is the 25th lesson of distance learning. Holy smokes, can you believe it? Well, this one is economies at war. Critical. Remember, the goal of the Anaconda Plan was to crush the Southern economy. So the economy is made up a huge part, not just of the strategy of winning the war, but the ability to pursue the war. This was a modern war as they understood it to be. Now, nowadays, we have just incredible machines, incredible weapons, incredible technology. But back then, this was cutting edge stuff. The Civil War, they transported messages by telegraph. That was amazing. This was a world which, up to that point, had relied on people running or riding horses over to deliver messages far, far away. John Pope, when he was on the battlefield at Second Bull Run and said he'd won such a startling victory over Stonewall Jackson, sent that message by telegraph over to Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C. They had started off to use balloons for weather forecasting and such, but they quickly discovered these things made good observation decks. It was like having the high ground. You couldn't put a cannon up in a balloon basket, but you could see where the enemy was. And having a telegraph, they could bring one end of the telegraph up into the balloon, and despite the noise of battle, could telegraph back down to the ground and let the commanders know what was going on. Joe Johnston at First Bull Run became the first general to deliver an army to a battlefield in the entire history of the world. It was that first little group of cavalry at Gettysburg that were the first group in the Union Army to get repeating rifles. And when the Confederates came up in greater force, the Union could hold them off because their rifles could fire so many more times than the Confederate weapons could. There was the Hunley in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, the first successful submarine attack in history. The ironclads, the Monitor and the Virginia, the first ever fight between ships that weren't just wooden ships. And finally, there was battlefield first aid. Instead of waiting days to get to somebody and try to fix them after the battle was over, they were moving people back and trying to take care of their bodies and their minds a little closer to the time when they were wounded. This is a picture of Eric Broxton upside down. The reason Eric Broxton is upside down is because, frankly, I'm not very good with a computer. And when I tried to put in a picture of young sixth grade Eric, this is the best I could do. Military striking power is finally supported, conditioned, and limited by the physical scope and vitality of the basic economy. Oh, holy smokes, Mr. Holman, you're throwing adult words at us. This is terrible. It really is very simple. How much money a country generates, how much they can produce, that equals their ability to go to war. So the ability to fight depends on what the economy is. I mean, think about right now. If you take a little tiny country that doesn't produce much, could they possibly compete with the United States in a regular war, army versus army? Well, no, we have the biggest economy in the world. And my gosh, we have huge air forces and huge navies and huge armies. And we have so much at our disposal, all kinds of incredible weapons and technology because our economy is strong. Valor and devotion are not enough to win if it goes past the initial stages. Remember, the Confederates understood that they didn't have industry like the North, but what they thought they would do is go north, fight one decisive battle, and their valor, their bravery, their guts, and their devotion to their cause of states' rights and slavery, that would be enough that the North would run away. But the North did not run away. And so it stretched out into years, as Winfield Scott had predicted, and that's not enough. The valor and devotion aren't enough if it goes past the initial stages. It takes a strong economy. The South had rejected the Industrial Revolution. They didn't want it. The Industrial Revolution was the decisive factor. Think about it. Up north, they've got factories. They're producing all kinds of weapons, cannons, swords, bayonets, rifles, wagons, saddles, clothing, everything they need to fight a war. Down south, they still have a slave economy, an agricultural economy, an economy that pretty much they're growing tobacco and other crops on a farm. They don't have the ability to make the things that the North does to wage this war. Well, what had slavery done for the South? Actually, it had kept the South from developing a class of skilled workers. If you think about it, why would somebody go into a job? Why would they learn to be a bricklayer, a mason, a carpenter? Why would they do that kind of a job? Because there was a need for it. Somebody would pay them for it, but, well, frankly, slaves were doing an awful lot of that kind of work. Therefore, they didn't have the skilled workers. Slavery had kept the South rural. They didn't have a lot of big cities. They had a few, but they were mostly just transportation hubs for moving the cotton and crops, railroad yards, shipping docks. That was it. The rest of it was spread way out because they wanted the big plantations, the farms, the farm fields, which separates people. And slavery had kept the South from developing industry. Frankly, they didn't want it because they were making so much money growing cotton. Incidentally, I put the Confederate flags and the Northern flags from the time on these slides so you'd be sure to identify which side I was talking about. As a result of all that, remember we're talking about the South again, they didn't make any railroad tracks during the whole war. If a railroad track was destroyed, in the North, they had amazing ways of destroying the tracks. It started off that they would simply pick up a track and bend it around a tree. But the South actually had the ability in their factories or their foundries to straighten out those railroad tracks and put them back again. So the North invented a very interesting tool which went on the end of a piece of railroad track and could be twisted. The South didn't have the ability to change that. So during the whole war, the Confederacy didn't produce any more railroad tracks. When the North destroyed them, the South just had fewer miles of railroad. The South was agricultural. They had lots of farm fields, and they grew plenty of food. But because they hadn't invested in the transportation, they couldn't get it to the consumer. Consumers, a word you've probably heard. The consumer is the person who actually uses the product. So there was food rotting in the fields in the South and people starving in Richmond and Atlanta and some of the bigger cities where the war was going on. Shoes and clothing had to be taken from the dead Federals. Federals are Northern soldiers because they simply couldn't produce it down south. They didn't have factories, mills for making cloth. What they had was ladies looming and spinning and sewing to make cloth and uniforms, and that took an awfully long time. They couldn't keep up with the demand, so they took the clothes from the dead soldiers they'd killed on the other side. They took them from their own dead, too, if they were in good shape. And the South had an unstable currency. The money wasn't worth much. Wait, that looks like Salah Ahmed. But hold it. Look at that haircut. He looks so good. Actually, I put this one in just for Salak's mom so she could remember what he looked like before he had, I don't know, what do you call that? The wing style hair? Okay. What happened in the North? In the North, industry boomed. As a matter of fact, it boomed to such a degree that they developed industry a whole generation sooner. And by that, I mean, well, they had new machines, new inventions, faster production a whole 20 years sooner. Now, not everything was good in the North. They did have some problems here. Before I get to farms, let me tell you what those were. Don't have a slide, so here's where you're going to have to do a little more serious note taking. The North had huge casualty lists. By that, I mean they'd publish them in the paper and put them out along the streets, and there were whole towns that were wiped out in the North. Because you see, people used to join up with their friends and neighbors from the same area. So you'd get a troop of cavalry that came from Brookfield, Wisconsin. And if that troop was wiped out, that was all the men from Brookfield, Wisconsin. The young male population of whole towns wiped out. The war was very expensive for the North, too. That was a second thing. The expenditure rose to as much as $2 million a day, and that was the 1860s. Inflation hurt the average man. That's something else. Inflation is when the government just prints more money, so the money you have in your pocket is worth less and less and less as more money becomes available. It's too much money chasing too few goods. So inflation hurt the average man. And then there were these people called war profiteers. War profiteers, terrible. They made it seem as if the war was for their benefit. And there were terrible situations with war profiteers. There were actually people who sold the Union Army boots made out of cardboard. Can you imagine that? Being so interested in just earning a dollar that you'd be willing to send to people who are off fighting your country shoes that were made out of cardboard. Now they needed boots, and what would those last? 10 minutes, an hour, get wet, they're gone. Ridiculous. They also, in some cases several times over, sold to the Northern Army non-functioning guns. You imagine that? Think about somebody who wants money so desperately, is so greedy, that they would sell a gun that they knew didn't work. What they'd do is they'd go to the buyer, let's say in the city of Baltimore, and they would say, hey, what did you give me for 1,000 of these rifles? And they would have one that worked. And the Army would look at it and say, oh, geez, we'll pay you $10 each for that. So, wow, I had 1,000, that's $10,000 to get the money. Then these war profiteers would wait. When the Army discovered that the rest of the muskets didn't work or the rest of the rifles didn't work, they'd try to sell them. They told them people that they didn't work, but they were just selling them for scrap, for the metal or whatever. And the war profiteers themselves would buy them back, maybe for $1 each. So now it's $1,000. You made 10,000, you buy them back for 1,000. You go over from Baltimore to Philadelphia, do the same thing. Sometimes war profiteers would sell rotten meat to the Army. These terrible people, amoral. They had no morals. And finally, the last of the Northern load was they had big taxes. They were being taxed hard. All right, back to what else happened in the North. Farm goods sold at a premium. When I say farm goods, I'm not just talking about food, but I'm talking about byproducts too. So remember, if I grow cattle to have milk, I have dairy cows. My product is the milk. If I grow beef cattle, my product is the beef, the meat of the animal. But there are other things that can be made from the rest of the cow. For example, with the beef cattle, there's the skin from which can be made leather belts and boots, saddles and whips. Well, those sold at a premium too. Those are byproducts. The definition there is something produced in the production of something else, something made in the production of something else. It's an interesting thing about farmers. Farmers are very tied to the land. I mean, every day they go out and they put their hands into the dirt. They're close to the soil. And when the country is attacked, farmers have traditionally gone to war in a much higher percentage than people in other jobs. Well, farmers went to war in large numbers, but it didn't really hurt the production of the North because it was just when the Industrial Revolution hit farming. That's what capital I, capital R is there, Industrial Revolution. And there were all kinds of new inventions. There were plows and planters, cultivators, mowers, reapers, thrashing machines. No, you don't have to write all those down and replay the tape 17 times. Just understand there were a lot of machines coming. The Homestead Act of 1862 Over across the Mississippi River in what had been the Louisiana Territory, Abraham Lincoln and the North had a lot of land. What they didn't have was food with which to feed their armies. So they came up with the idea of the Homestead Act, which was enacted in 1862, which said, hey, anyone which will go out or who will go out to the West, start a farm, grow food, and sell it to the government. Not give it to the government, sell it to the government. Remember, they're paying a premium. That means even above what the market would hold. Anyone who will go out, start a farm, grow food, and sell it to the government can have the farm for free. As a result, even with the huge number of casualties that the North suffered during the Civil War, more than 800,000 people came from around the world, mostly Europeans, to go get the offers of those free farms to come over and have a chance over here. Because remember, this is the land of opportunity. And what couldn't people get in Europe? Land. And land was a key to power. The railroad grew because the North could produce railroad tracks, and they had to get over to where all of those farms were so they could bring the things to market. Finally, there was the National Bank Act of 1863. It had been that, yes, there was United States currency, US dollars, but as we talked about when we mentioned the Mormons, it might be an insurance company produces its own dollars or a bank around town because money was hard to come by and that was a respected institution. Everybody thought the business was strong, so they accepted their money. Well, now with the National Bank Act of 1863, the government's trying to get more control of that. So they say, no, there's just one currency, and that would be United States dollars. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It has been a pleasure. I want to tell you that, as they say on Sesame Street, today's video was brought to you by the letter S. S for Sasquatch or Sebastian. I really like this. I actually saw this in a parking lot not far from my house the other day. And what I really like is the sticker that shows a picture of a Sasquatch and it says, believe. So you guys should talk to your moms, talk to your dads, tell them it is possible to get really cool paintings on your automobiles. You don't have to settle for whatever the factory makes. Goodbye, tiny people. I love you and I miss you and I hope to see you soon. Hasta la vista, babies.